Welcome back everyone to another MCAT ACE lecture. This video is going to cover the functions of the plasma membrane as well as its composition, which is made of the lipid as well as protein components. And then we will describe the fluid mosaic model, go over different modes of transport across the cell membrane, discuss the functions of proteins within the cell membrane, which includes acting as channels, enzymes, or receptors. We will go over the difference between exocytosis and endocytosis, and then finally we will discuss how the cell membrane of the adjacent cells are being connected to each other. Alright, so starting with the general functions of the cell membrane. So the first obvious function of the cell membrane is to define borders of cells. And then of course, because now there is a membrane around the cell, it will help maintain the cell integrity. It will provide selective permeability for the passage of molecules inside and outside the cell. In addition, plasma membrane has a flexible structure that allows cell to pass through narrow spaces, so flexible membrane. And a good example is like, for instance, red blood cells that can go through narrow spaces of the blood vessels. And then finally, there are receptors as well as markers on the cell membrane that helps recognition by other cells, like for instance by immune cells. And for instance, in the immunology section we just discussed how the MHC1, which is major histocompatibility complex 1 glycoproteins, are on the cell surface in order to recognize cells and not to attack them by our immune cells. Next, we are discussing the composition of the membranes. So basically, membranes are made of three main structures, which includes lipids, carbohydrates, as well as proteins. So we would like to first start with describing the composition, the lipid components of the cell membrane, which include phospholipids, and each molecule of phospholipid is made of one glycerol plus two fatty acids and a phosphate polar head. And so here I'm showing you an image of a phospholipid. So here we have all the three components that I just described for you. We have a glycerol attached to two molecules of fatty acids, and then there is a phosphate polar head. And so since the phosphate has a negative charge, therefore it's polar and it would be hydrophilic, versus the fatty acids, which are chains of carbohydrates. This one is non-polar and would be hydrophobic. Now, because of the structure of phospholipids that contains both a polar head and a non-polar tail, it's referred to as amphiphilic or dual loving, because this molecule contains both a charged and a non-charged area. Now, because of this unique structure of phospholipids, they would try to avoid water content of the cell as much as they can. And so therefore the cell membrane will have a lipid bilayer where the polar head of phospholipids, which would correspond to the phosphate head, would be facing outside as well as inside of the cell. So here we have the extracellular space that has so much water, as well as intracellular space, which again has water. So therefore the polar heads, which are hydrophilic, are now in contact with water, while the non-polar tails, which were fatty acid and are hydrophobic, are avoiding the water content of the cell. Now, another way that phospholipids can present inside an aqueous solution is that they could form a micelle, where they would form a circular form and having the tails facing each other, and the polar head will face the external water environment. And then finally, liposome is another way that phospholipids can arrange together. And with the liposome, they would be having again a bilayer that goes circular. Alright, and so this way we have all the non-polar tail at the center, while the polar head is facing the outside environment, which has a lot of water, and another polar head is on the inner surface of the liposome, which will face the water that is being trapped inside the liposome. Alright, so that concludes discussion of phospholipids. Let's move on to the next lipid molecule that we commonly encounter in a cell membrane, and this includes the cholesterol, which is made of 4 fused carbon rings, and its function is actually to reduce permeability of the cell membrane while maintaining fluidity of the cell membrane at low temperatures. And here I'm going to show you an example